All right. Today, I'd like to talk a bit about something that's not entirely related to digital advertising, online advertising, but look at something that's going on contemporaneous with it. And that is advertising in the age of media conglomeration. That is one company eating up or incorporating or dissolving another media company into its body and another media company and another media company so that it begins to look relatively powerful in terms of the cultural scene. To do that, I want to talk about a couple of terms briefly and try not to complicate matters too much, but to give us a sense of how this has all evolved. And the two terms are vertical integration and horizontal integration. So vertical is reading from, say, top to bottom or bottom to top, horizontal from left to right. And so what we're seeing on screen are some media production companies. So let's just take a movie studio like Warner Brothers. It used to be from the early ages of film production through about the middle 50s that a studio like Warner Brothers would own the means of production. That is, they could make movies at a studio where they had equipment to do that. Equipment and personnel, actors, directors, cameras, and editing equipment, and so on. So they could get the product made. And people still resent thinking of films that way as a product or any media form, a record or CD, a television show. They could market it, that is, advertise it, and that would mean, in the case of motion pictures through the 1950s, coming attractions at theaters, posters, radio spots, things of that nature. They could distribute the films, that is, get them made in 35 millimeter film. To distribute them to movie theaters throughout the country was pretty expensive when you consider that each, say, 90-minute film weighed in the neighborhood of 50 pounds to 75 pounds per package. So one film would weigh about that much in these huge metal boxes they were shipped around the country. So movie studios own that. They would also own the means of exhibition. And in the case of movie theaters, that would mean, or rather movie studios, they would own the theaters. And so they would have basically everything to do with films under the umbrella of one company. From at least early 1940s, this was deemed as problematic. Problematic because it was seen as being monopolistic. Very few movie companies had the power, the money, the wherewithal to make motion pictures. And so after World War II, and was after World War II because Hollywood was seen as really important to the propaganda machine at that time to keep the morale of the troops and the nation and other nations up. So they were broken up in the 1950s, the movie studios were. And basically what happened was they had to get rid of theaters, the movie theaters, which was a problem for the motion picture industry because that's where all the money came in. So in any case, again, this was deemed vertical integration as being monopolistic and the companies broke up. So I want to compare that to what's going on now, which looks an awful lot like horizontal integration, although they're calling it synergy. So horizontal integration then has to do with one corporate entity absorbing, buying out another. So reading left to right or right to left, so that Warner Brothers or 20th Century Fox would buy up another media company, not necessarily film related, like, for example, DC Comics and a gaming company and or a television network. What you had then, beginning in the 1980s and continuing to today, but really exploding in the 90s and early 2000s, was the consolidation of these really powerful companies. So you can see that in 1983, 90% of the media was owned by 50 companies, and by 2012, 90% of the media was owned by 6 media giants. The names have changed. Facebook is up there now. But process remains pretty much the same. This is pretty much what you have today. So you have a company like Alphabet, which you may not have heard of, but it's the parent company of Google, which, as you know, is huge. Number two, Walt Disney. Number three, Comcast, et cetera, et cetera. Facebook clocking in at number five. And I want to take a look at what these companies own and then how that relates to advertising. I want to keep this simple and lend a historical perspective to this a bit as well. So in the 1920s, the Walt Disney Studios opened, 1923, and all they did, and it was significant, was to make films that became incredibly popular. At first, short black and white films, and later, in the early 30s, full-length motion pictures that were shown in theaters that they didn't own. So simply a studio. Later, they began to migrate. They had a television show, the Mickey Mouse Club in the 1950s, later the Walt Disney Show, and later in the 1950s, they opened up their first theme park. So they're beginning to kind of expand the pull of what they owned. And that included, by the 1950s, consumer products. Very marginally, but they did produce, for example, lunch boxes, and for the television show, the Davy Crockett Show, fake little coonskin hats. So they did have some consumer products. They had publishing later that they integrated, and then now vacation resorts and planned communities. So like the planned community being Celebration in Florida, which is actually a town that you can live in and be a part of the Disney world. In the process of conglomeration and the process of synergy, the Walt Disney Company then began to just buy what were then freestanding entities of media. So, for example, ESPN, the sports network, became gobbled up by Walt Disney World. Touchstone Pictures, which was an independent entity, was gobbled up. A&E TV, ESPN TV, ABC, the at one time huge and independent television broadcasting system. And so it began to be that a movie could be released by the Disney company and be reviewed by a publishing entity like, for example, Empire Magazine, which would review it. And so these corporate conglomerates would become, again, to go back to the earlier slide, pretty powerful and very monopolistic looking. So these are the companies now that do make more money from the stuff they sell than the movies themselves, which is how Disney began, with just movies themselves. So I want to look a little bit deeply at the current scene relative to advertising in these media conglomerates. One thing you're already familiar with is product placement, thanks to the video on gaming that we saw. And you just might want to pay attention to how often, for example, a product makes an appearance in a television show or a motion picture. And when that happens, it's not by accident. So even cars in those Marvel superhero films, which, by the way, are brought to you by Disney, pay to have their product represented. This happens on television shows as well. This is from a famous South Park episode that showed the characters playing and having a great time playing Guitar Hero, which then became a game. Guitar Hero 3 was turned into a South Park edition. But again, product placement is simply, but sometimes obnoxiously, a company paying a film conglomerate to put a product into their film, sometimes in kind of subtle ways, sometimes they'll actually be talking about it. Soap operas on television are notorious for this, characters stopping to talk about their products. But you're seeing it more and more in feature films and in television shows and video games, as we saw as well. And so just quickly, the Marvel Acura that was paid for in James Bond films, the watch, and so on and so forth. So just pay attention to how often products are subtly or not so subtly sometimes introduced into the narrative of a film, including into Disney films. The first film to really, the film that was sort of there when it happened in 1977, in encouraging this sort of trans media advertising and marketing, which doesn't look quite like advertising, but is responsible for generating more sales, was Star Wars. And when it was released, it wasn't clear whether or not it was going to be a popular movie. It soon became clear that it would be. There were lines forming around theaters in Chicago and other major cities. And it didn't take long for the toy manufacturer Hasbro to release these obviously geared toward kids and not that expensive set of action figures. Good luck trying to get these on eBay for less than $500 today in any condition. But, and of course, some of these are more valuable than others. But we move from this kind of relatively limited experience, toys, small, to this, which opened in Disneyland in 2022, I think it was. Recently, in any case, it also closed in May of this year, 2023. The Star Wars experience, where for $1,200 a person per night, you could live in a Star Wars-like environment. So obviously, this very high-end experience. So what we're going to be talking about throughout the rest of this is other films employing this sort of advertising strategy, transmedia. Another environmental space where you could inhabit the world, and putting this all in quotation marks, of a non-fictional toy character was Barbie Restaurant, which opened this year in Chicago for a brief period of time. It was a pop-up restaurant, so it was meant to close early, but for its duration was incredibly popular and, of course, far less expensive than Star Wars hotel experience. Speaking of Star Wars, we're going back to the second Star Wars film, and when we began to get this sense of igniting the popularity of the film and kind of capitalizing on it by selling stuff related, therefore kind of cross-advertising. The film becomes an advertisement for the stuff, becomes an advertisement for the television series, becomes an advertisement for the film, and so on. And so it literally became possible to live, eat, sleep, drink Star Wars. And if you're of a more adult and sophisticated mind, you have the more adult, sophisticated Star Wars bed spread ensemble. And for those youngsters and teenagers in your life, we have the Marvel Spider-Man superhero costumes. This, of course, now a subsidy of Disney. With the release of Elemental, we had the very unsurprising release of the McDonald's Happy Meal, which of course is associated with Disney products for quite some time, and which also had a connection to Star Wars. An action figure, this time from Guardians of the Galaxy, which we've now had 3 variations of. Interestingly, these toys, such as they are worth more money if you never open them. So if you never play with this stuff, they're going to be more valuable, presumably in the future. Guardians of the Galaxy Monopoly set, and not surprisingly, there are a whole slew of Monopoly sets now available. This is kind of interesting. It's a t-shirt, as you can see, but it's also a t-shirt that borrows its image from the vinyl edition of the Guardians of the Galaxy soundtrack. So a t-shirt where you can wear your appreciation of the soundtrack to the original Guardians of the Galaxy and become, in essence, a walking billboard yourself, as people like Thomas Frank, who you read last time, might have it. The Guardians of the Galaxy playset, the Guardians of the Galaxy Nacho Cheese Edition collectible, never open them, the Guardians of the Galaxy book for kids. And in California, we have what was once the Tower of Terror based on the Twilight Zone ride. You now have the Guardians of the Galaxy ride. So a film nowadays can make more money from the stuff that accumulates around it than the film itself by far, including ties, including like this interesting Angry Birds movie. And of course, Angry Birds was first a app game that became a film that became a Lego toy. So it's like an infinity of mirrors, right? Cereals, of course, are big. We saw with other products, gaming, and this, of course, being taking what was originally a book, The Hunger Games, which became a film, which became an Xbox game. And as we learned from our last module, how Xbox games or games, digital games in general, are pretty heavy with advertising. You could pick up some Hunger Games, Catching Fire, food, like interesting combination, beef jerky and smoked mesquite and milk chocolate, your Katniss collectible, your Hunger Games District 12 hoodie, your Avengers collectible for heroic men's colognes. So basically, this stuff, like the toys, are training you to become a lifelong resident, as we'll see in a bit, of purchasing this stuff. This was for Twilight, the film Twilight, and it was Edward collectible underwear. I'm not sure that it was actually collectible. This is naughty 50 Shades of Grey. Naughty stuff that you could buy, but clearly geared to the adult. Card game sets. And this is what I was talking about when you could basically live your life devoted to purchasing this stuff. This was a single collector's exhibit that was, of course, Star Wars devoted. And you can see there's a lot of stuff here in the background that was like one editions or very limited editions, including a very big statue in the right-hand corner, but also including inexpensive stuff as well, those bubble-wrapped collectibles, but really quite impressive. Another theme park experience. This time it's Universal Studios and Harry Potter with the Harry Potter World, and jumping back to Disney with The Lion King and The Lion King Carnival. And as you know, The Lion King became a play. This is a advertisement for a Lion King exhibit experience in China. And China is a huge market now for film. So the tendency is for films that are being produced in the United States to make them very China friendly. In other words, don't upset the political apple cart. Be sure to include Chinese characters. And even then, if the tensions are high, as they have been in the last couple of years between the China and the U.S., there's still a possibility that China won't play it. So I'm going to leave it here at that. And I'd like you to consider now how you perceive all this in the context of advertisement. So that'll be my last question to you. How does all of this relate to advertising? Take care. I'll see you soon.